Welcome everyone once again to a very special edition of Talking Point with Mayor Mike. Today we're going to talk about our trip to Rostov Veliky, our sister city in Russia. A group of us from Stevens Point got together last August and traveled to our sister city as part of a cultural exchange through the Sister Cities International program. So with me today are several guests, everyone who went on the trip. We have our Director of Public Utilities, Joel Lemke, Maya Johnson, who is with the Sister Cities International program, of course myself, my wife Chris, and Ron and Donna Zimmerman. Ron was the director over at Schmeeckley Reserve, and Donna is an educator. So we had a small group of people travel to our sister city in Rostov Veliky last August, and we're finally now getting around to doing the show about how our trip went. Maya, why don't you talk a little bit about the Sister City program, Sister Cities International, and how it got started and how Stevens Point got involved?
Sure. So back in 1983, there was a group of concerned citizens. This was back in the Cold War era. And they just thought there has to be more than this. So they found this project called the Ground Zero Pairing Project, and they got paired up with Rostov Veliky. And the reason Stevens Point and Rostov got paired together is because they're very similar in size. We're both on bodies of water. We have the river, they have a lake. And so we started that as an exchange for sharing our culture with them, and they could share theirs with us. And then just kind of, so we could realize that they're just normal people like us. They have the same day-to-day lives that we do, and there's really not much difference. And so later on, I think it was 1989, we asked to be recognized as an official sister city through Sister Cities International, and they granted that. So we continued our exchanges with them, and we've done several professional exchanges, we've done student exchanges, there's been tourist groups, and these exchanges go both ways. They've come over here, we've gone over there. The mayors in both cities have been very active in our program over the years. Several of their mayors have come to visit Stevens Point. Several of ours have gone over to Rostov. And they've always been very supportive and encouraging for this program. We've always kept politics out of it. This is just a people-to-people exchange, so we can learn more about each other and kind of grow peace through friendship.
Right. Well, and, and it speaks to that friendship because two of our guides, who are now very close friends, Aliona and Luba, had actually come here as part of the exchange program and went to Spash. Yep. Now they're back in Rostov Veliky. And this semester, we have another exchange student at Spash. She arrived early February, and she'll be here for the whole semester. So we're still continuing that exchange. Yep. So, Chris, I know you did a lot of the geographic work. There's actually two Rostovs. Why don't you tell people where Rostov is and maybe a little bit of history about it and why they call it Rostov Veliky?
Well, we were in Rostov Veliky, which means Rostov the Great, which is located in the Yaroslavl region. Rostov is about 126 miles northeast of Moscow. And it was founded in 862, so it's a really old city.
1,155 years.
Yeah, so the population is a little over 31,000. It's about 12 square miles, and they're located on the shore of Lake Nero, which is a 20 square mile lake, and that lake is actually estimated to be about 500,000 years old. Wow. So it's actually pre-Ice Age, which is, we don't see those very frequently, so that was pretty cool. The official name of the city is Rostov, but they call it Rostov Veliky to separate it from another Rostov, Rostov-on-Don, which is actually a larger city than Rostov Veliky. And that city is located farther south in Russia. And actually, Rostov is still in Europe. Many people think that Russia is just Asia, and we actually didn't get into Asia. We stayed in Europe.
Yeah, Moscow is in Europe. One of the things that I talked about with the mayor was we have a city flag. Rostov Veliky has its own flag, and that's
it's a white stag on a red background.
On a red background. They also have their own city song. So I told them, I said, we're going to work on it. Maybe I can get some UWSP students to work on a Stevens Point song. One of the things that Rostov Veliky and a lot of the Russian cities are trying to do now after the Soviet era is promote a little bit of tourism. And I know that we're working with University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and their adventure tour for a program going there in 2019. So if anybody else is interested in going there. But Maya, why don't you talk a little bit about that program and the Kremlin and maybe their push for tourism and the Golden Ring?
Sure. So after communism fell, they figured out that they could have tourism as part of their economy. So when I first went in 1999, there was maybe 1 or 2 hotels. And now there's, I don't know, I'd say probably 15 to 20 in Rostov at least. Mm-hmm. And so our sister city has partnered up with UWSP Adventure Tours. And I'm going to be one of the leaders in 2019. We're going to go and fly into Moscow. We'll spend a few days there. We'll go over to Rostov, and we'll use that as our home base. And we're going to explore a couple cities in an area they call the Golden Ring, which are cities that are historically important to Russia and their history. So we'll spend a few days touring each city, and then we're going to head up to St. Petersburg and fly home from there.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds, I mean, it's really going to take what we did and take it one step further to see some of those other cities. We saw Pereslavl, Yaroslavl, and some of those areas, but I think this is going to be an exciting tour. I don't know if I'll be able to make it, but if you get a chance to go, if someone wants to find out more about the tour, where can they go?
Yeah, just go over to UWSP Adventure Tours website. You can sign up for an email list, and they'll keep you updated on what's happening.
Great. Speaking of the history in that Golden Ring, Ron, I know that you're kind of a history buff, and you were always quick with information about the history of the area and things like that. Why don't you talk a little bit about the history of Rostov as it relates to the rest of the area of Russia?
Sure, it's one of those real gems in the Golden Ring. And a lot of tourists are beginning to go there, but it's always been famous in Russia because Rostov is Rostov Veliky, the Great, primarily because it's so ancient and it's really a revered city for its history in Russia. It was a big, flourishing city well over 1,000 years ago. Yeah. And today, it's you step back in time when you go to Rostov. It's a quiet rural community today, but it has beautiful, literally hundreds of beautiful domed towers set on Lake Nero, which we've talked about before. The city itself has been there for a very long time. Probably was there 4,000 years ago in one way or another as settlements, because archaeologists have found those tribal settlements on the lake itself. So it's always been a good place to live. Way back, way before Christopher Columbus had ever stepped foot on our shores here in America, it had already been a thriving city, and in fact, in 1237, it was burned to the ground and pillaged by the Tartars, as much of Russia was at that time. But only 60 or 70 years later, again, it was a thriving center. This time, instead of just an economic center and a political center, it was a religious center for the Russian Orthodox Church. And of course, that's when they built what's known as the Rostov Kremlin. And Kremlins in Russia simply mean a walled enclosure. So it isn't necessarily a seat of government, though it can be. But in this case, it was a seat of religion. And that's when many of the big buildings were built, and then eventually not abandoned by the church, but became a lesser influence in the Orthodox Church in Russia. But the walls remain, the cathedral remains, and one of the great things that remains are the big bells that are symbolic of the city of Rostov. And it's well known for its bells. In fact, those bells, when Peter the Great had his great war with Sweden, he melted down most of the bells in Russia into cannons. But he spared those famous bells in Rostov, wow, as did the communists, although they stood silent for 50 years because the cathedral was no longer used. But today they ring out again. The biggest bell is 300 years old, 32 tons, and you can hear it 20 miles away.
Yeah, that bell tower was pretty amazing, and we actually got to take a little class, and we met some of the bell ringers. The sounds that the bells produce based on the size are used to create music and melodies. And I know that Rostov's bells were so popular that there's actually recordings, audio recordings of the bells. I know that the previous mayor had given me a copy of that recording. It was really hard to fathom the history that Rostov has. Stevens Point is going to be celebrating 160 years of existence this year. Rostov Veliky is 1,000 years older than that, at least. 1,000 years. One of the things that I had an issue with was the stairs, because the stairs were all uneven. There was no standard to any of the building code. But you got to remember that, 500-600 years ago there wasn't a building code, so they built with what they could and how they knew that. The one thing that I found very similar in talking with the mayor of Rostov was that even though we're a half a world apart, we experience the same problems. There's not enough money to fix the roads or maintain the parks or those sorts of things. So we had very similar challenges. And now I've had 4 mayors of Rostov Veliky that I've met, and every one of them says the same thing. It's the same challenges that we have here, they have there, a half a world apart. And it's always difficult to make ends meet with the budget and try and get everything that you want to get done. We met some of the firefighters, and we met some of the police officers, and again, it's all the same. They have parks to maintain and roads to maintain, just like we do. Some of the differences were the mayors aren't elected by the people like we do have here in the United States. They're appointed by their regional leaders, like the Yaroslavl region. The leader of that region, kind of like a governor, I guess, would make appointments to mayors. And as the mayors serve their term and then step down, they're like a vice mayor or a deputy mayor. So they're still involved in city government. Right now, the mayor Constantine is the vice mayor. He had been the mayor for the past couple of years. And Andrei Loy is the new mayor of Rostov Veliky. And Nadezhda, who organized a lot of our trip, was also a former mayor. So the styles of government are pretty similar. But again, we have the same types of issues, which I found very fascinating. I mean, the mayor and I had talked about that. But Joel, I know when we were looking at public utilities, there wasn't a time where we didn't look back and where's Joel? And he's got his head down a manhole or something looking at all of the infrastructure. Why don't you talk about some of the things that you found interesting regarding the infrastructure?
I have a nice collection of manhole casting pictures back in my office, yeah. Well, landing in Moscow, really not knowing what to expect on the trip from there to Rostov was really interesting. And I think we all saw a lot of construction going on, a lot of road maintenance, a lot of road construction, buildings, public transit, and that was really neat. A lot of similarities there. There's some stark differences too, but as we approach Rostov, we started getting into what we'd all recognize as a more rural community, and things are the same. You got your road, you got your shoulder, and you got a ditch, right? There's nothing that was really too surprising there. You get into Rostov, and I think that one of the things most commonly pointed out by our guests was the condition of the roads. And I guess something we could recognize too is they weren't the greatest. But on the other hand, when you go from Rostov to Yaroslavl or any other communities, those roads were great. So I think to your point, they, just like here, we try to prioritize things. We try to figure out where's the best place to put your money, try to figure out on what schedule you can do all this. So one of the biggest differences I think that we all recognize was maybe the fact that they're not walking around in really, really bright colors with steel-toed boots and hard hats on everywhere. It's sandals and shorts a lot, but it's a matter of time before that changes.
Sure.
I think we all recognize the gas mains going overhead, crossing the roads, was a little interesting and a little unfamiliar to us.
They didn't bury those utilities, was surprising.
They probably have a couple more months of frost than we do, so I can understand that. Maybe not too, but that was interesting. And then the effort they're putting into their Kremlin in the way of their infrastructure and replacing all of that older stuff is really impressive, and you can tell that's where they're focusing a lot.
Yeah, well, and the history that's in those buildings. I mean, when we went to City Hall, it's hard to imagine that building, our City Hall is 60 years old, and it doesn't function as well as it should. So we're looking at building a new city hall because we've kind of outlived that. Some of these buildings are hundreds of years old and they're still functional, and they have to be because that's the history of Russia.
Yeah.
Right.
The other interesting thing is that because of some of the holdover from the Soviet era on some of the things like water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, it looks like they're approaching it from a regional perspective, and that they might not handle it as the city of Rostov, but they might handle it in a more regional perspective moving forward, which makes sense.
And that brought up, triggered a little bit of a memory. We didn't see any water towers. See, here in the United States, we have water towers to create the pressure that comes out of your faucet. Yeah. But they told you, they explained how they do it.
Well,
tell us about that.
I think there was one there that we didn't see, but it was, again, a Soviet era piece of infrastructure. But beyond that, it could be on-demand pumping.
And on-demand, it means the pump is what creates the water pressure.
Pump it, yeah. And instead of having that storage mechanism in the air, they're always pumping against a pressure gradient of something, yeah.
You know, and when Ron was talking about our climates being very similar, that's probably a lot of the same problems that we have with our roads. Winter comes and snow turns into water, it falls between the cracks, and as it refreezes, it expands and creates bigger cracks and potholes and things like that. So they have the same challenges. In spring of every year, they're going to find tons of potholes, and we never have enough people to fill all the holes and fix all the cracks, and they have the same types of problems.
Same thing, yeah. I think one of the things we talked about a little bit was, all right, when the water utility or the gas line or whatever breaks, who comes back and fixes the road? You know, it's the same kind of arguments we have. Like, that's your problem, not mine.
That's right, someone else's. When so the steam was an interesting one. They have a big steam factory, and it pipes the steam above ground, and one of those pipes led directly to the school. Donna, why don't you talk a little bit about what we experienced at the school in Rostov Veliky and maybe that little program that we saw?
Sure. We had a wonderful morning. It was a very memorable morning that we spent at the A.L. Kikin Gymnasium and also at their athletic stadium as well. The gymnasium is a historic building as well. It's over 100 years old. It was built in 1910 by Alexei L. Kikin, who was a wealthy linen merchant, and he felt very strongly about education. So he built the building, the school building, for the people of Rostov. And this building was used during World War II as a hospital. And then after that, after the war was over, it became one of the leading university preparatory high schools in the country. So very famous school. And it has a long history. It has a museum with historical artifacts and so on in it, which we were able to tour, and also the observatory, which had a huge telescope. So we were able to all go up those stairs all the way to the top and look through the telescope. And then the other thing about the school is that it's important to us and our connection, again, as a sister city. Since 1992, through our sister city program here in Stevens Point, we have sent students, or teachers, excuse me, and assistants, teaching assistants through the sister city program to Rostov at the gymnasium to teach English there, English language. And in fact, we have group going this
Dan
year
Hoppy's
as well.
going this year.
Yeah.
How about the field, the soccer field?
Oh, the soccer field is awesome. It's actually a stadium. It has a lot of different school activities that take place there, and it has soccer and mixed martial arts and wrestling, and it has a building where they have military classes and different things like that. And we were able to actually participate in some of the practice of the
Participate's
soccer
a good
teams.
word, because we certainly weren't playing soccer.
I know, we
We're
were
not that
trying
good
to
at it.
kick goals in, and the goalie was really good on the team, and so
He pretended that we gave him a bit of a challenge.
he tried to.
And the young students that were doing the dancing, we got to do a little modern dancing with them. I think that was kind of fun.
Right. And then I think one of the greatest honors was when the students, this was in August, mind you, so they were on vacation, on summer vacation, just like our students here are. Yeah. And all the students and their parents came into the gymnasium and they put on a wonderful performance of ballet and folk dances and singing and everything. And we had front row seats. So it was just such an honor to see that. And it was such a beautiful thing to share. It was a fabulous
performance. You know, in talking about the similarities, we are kind of a paper town, and Rostov is too. Ron got caught squeezing the Charmin a couple of times when we toured the tissue factory. Why don't you talk about your experience there, Ron?
I hope you didn't get pictures of that. Yeah, interestingly enough, the similarities between the environment around Rostov Veliky and Stevens Point is very much the same. And one of the things that you would expect to find would be the same species of trees, which we use for producing paper and tissue products and so forth, are exactly the same species of trees that they have. So birch, aspen, spruce, pine, hemlock, that sort of thing, all make excellent tissue paper, and their tissue production was really top-notch, and they export a lot of tissue to the rest of Europe, but also Russia has gone way up in its use of toilet paper and tissue, possibly because they've taken on more of a Western lifestyle in many cases. So the factories are big and modern, and to a great extent, good government subsidies in the paper industry today.
Yeah, well, you know, like I said before, everybody's got a wipe, right? It was interesting, though, with these plants, it went from the raw product through the factory, and at the end of the factory was the finished product, all in one place, not like we do here. We have ours a little differently. The stories that we have, some of them we are going to live with us forever, but Joel's self-portrait over at the Enamel Factory. Donna, why don't you talk about our experiences, because enamel's pretty big in Rostov as well.
Yes, it is. Actually, as an artist and a former design educator, I was thrilled to see these little gems. There's a museum in the Kremlin that hosts a lot of 2,500 different pieces of enamel, Rostov Enamel Factory, it's called. And it's a very specialized type of technology that they use for making these. It's copper, basically, with enamel on it, and then they have special paints that are subject to heat, and so they have to fire them quite a bit, but you can paint different items on them. And Rostov is actually known for their enamel factory, for not only the technology, but also the beautiful items that come from the manufacturer there. It actually began in the 10th century. Wow. And it became very popular in the 16th and 17th century. And in the 18th century, the monks at a monastery had a workshop there where they actually produced these items. They used most of them for the church, and church vestments and plates and things like that for the church ceremonies. But later on in the early 20th century or 19th century, they actually began to make household items like pendants and brooches and little boxes. And what's really unique about them is they have certain characteristics. The Rostov Enamel Factory has certain characteristics about them in their imagery. They tell stories. They tell biblical stories. They tell stories about everyday life. They have the flora and fauna incorporated on these little miniature enamel pieces. So they're really telling the story of Rostov, which is what I find really, really interesting. And they're beautiful.
There were some very beautiful pieces. One of the things that we did too, excuse me, to solidify our trip is near the end of our trip to Rostov. We got our groups of friends together and we planted some trees in Victory Park. Chris, I know that was one of your things with Larissa. So why don't you tell us what we did?
We went to Victory Park, which is a park that celebrates Rostov's participation in World War II, or as they called it, the Patriotic War. So there's about 30,000 people that live in Rostov. 16,000 people went and fought in World War II. And of those 16,000, 13,000 people actually died in the war. So they, in 1982, unveiled this beautiful monument of 4 soldiers in Victory Park. And we started our trip there by laying roses at the feet of the monument to pay our respect. And then behind the monument, we planted maple trees. So Mayor Constantine and Larissa, who is the entertainment director in Rostov, and my sister, from another mother, I should say, planted a tree for Rostov, and then you and I planted one to represent Stevens Point, and then the rest of our group, along with Dimitri, who is the chief engineer, planted the 3rd maple tree to represent our everlasting friendship. And it was really interesting, first of all, that they used maple trees because that's our state tree. They didn't realize that, but it just kind of put another level of meaning for me, anyway. And I get a little choked up when I talk about this because we met people there that are going to be friends for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
And
we still talk. You know, Facebook makes the world much smaller.
Every day.
You know, and it's nice to know that we have a little piece of Stevens Point and a little piece of ourselves that we left in Rostov Veliky with our new friends there. And one of the things that the mayor and I had talked about, so the Rotary Club, in conjunction with the Sister Cities International program and the Partners of the Americas program, is looking at putting a park within a park at Pifter Pioneer Park, and they're calling it Cultural Commons. So within that is going to be the representation of our 2 sister cities, Rostov Veliky, Russia, and Gulch, Poland, and our partner city, Esteli, Nicaragua. So there's going to be 3 segments that are representative of that, and they're all going to show a little bit about the cities that they represent. So the people here in Stevens Point can learn more about our sister cities and our partner cities. One of the things, as Ron mentioned, that Rostov Veliky is very famous for is that bell tower. And the mayor and I talked about this, and together we're gonna split the cost of getting a bell cast in Russia, and then shipping it over here to be incorporated into the Cultural Commons park area. They also promised that when they have the bell here, and we're going to do a dedication, that our friends from Russia are going to be able to join us here for that park dedication and dedicate that bell to kind of solidify those friendships that we made on our trip. The Cultural Commons program is still going on. They're trying to raise money. I think they're about $50,000 away from their goal, and that's going to hopefully break ground this summer. So if anybody's interested in learning more about the Cultural Commons program, you can Google Cultural Commons Stevens Point. There's information on the Community Foundation website, or you can call my office and I can put you in touch with whoever you might want to be talking to about this, whether it's the Rotary Club or any of our sister cities if you are interested in learning more about that. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We are planning another episode that is going to talk a little bit more about the fun things we did and the cultural things. The food, I know, is going to be a big one in our trips to the monasteries. So that'll be another episode of Talking Point. But I want to thank you again, Joel, our Public Utilities Director, Maya from the Sister Cities Program, my lovely wife, Chris, and Ron and Donna Zimmerman. I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for becoming our friends and joining us on that trip to Rostov. Until next time, I'm Mayor Mike, and this has been a special edition of Talking Point, or maybe it's Talking Rostov, I guess. We'll have to change that. Until next time, we'll see you later.